Have you ever thought about how the whole story of art is like completely tied up with the story of humans?
Yeah, I mean, it's like you can't really separate them, can you?
It's fascinating, right? From like those first cave paintings to, the art that's all over your phone. Art changes as we discover new technology, as our worldviews change, even as our societies change. And what I find really cool is that exploring art history isn't just about appreciating a nice picture. It's more like a way to understand ourselves and like where we come from.
Totally. It's
Wow.
like a window, right? A window into what people believed, what they were afraid of, what they hoped for. When you start to connect the dots between these periods, like starting with the earliest forms of symbolic thought all the way to now, with all the art we see today, you start to see some pretty revealing patterns.
So for this deep dive, we've got a really interesting mix of sources for you. Some YouTube talks, some articles, all about the major movements in Western art. We're not trying to make you an expert overnight, but we do want to give you a clear understanding of these periods, how each one came about, what makes them unique, and most importantly, how they all connect. Sometimes how they like even push against each other.
Yeah, like a conversation across time.
Exactly. Think of this as a cheat sheet to the world of art history, so you can feel confident talking about it without getting totally lost in all the details.
We want to highlight the big turning points so you can see how this visual dialogue has been going on for centuries.
Okay, let's dive in. Let's start at the very beginning. Way before recorded history, humans were making art. Cave paintings, early sculptures. What can we learn from those earliest expressions?
I think the big takeaway here is that even in these very first forms, we see evidence of abstract thought and symbolism. Remember, this is long before advanced civilizations.
Right.
These weren't just random doodles. It suggests that even way back then, humans had a need to express ideas, to make meaning beyond just survival.
Right, it wasn't just about finding food and shelter anymore.
Exactly.
And then, fast forward a bit, we see these more developed ancient civilizations like Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome. Our sources also mention Persia and China. How does their art differ from those earlier forms?
Well, you start to see more naturalistic images of people. Art takes on these important roles in religion and government. Think about the massive sculptures in Egypt. They're all about the power of the pharaohs and their beliefs about the afterlife.
Wow, yeah.
Or look at the idealized human forms in Greek sculpture, which reflected their philosophies about beauty and perfect proportions. It's all connected.
And speaking of Greece, it feels like they really laid the groundwork for a lot of European art that came later, especially in architecture.
Absolutely. Their skill with materials like marble was incredible. Think about those amazingly lifelike draperies on their statues, all the folds and the flow. That level of craftsmanship had a lasting impact.
Really?
Yeah, when you look at later architectural designs across Europe, you can see the echoes of Greece everywhere, in all those ornate carvings, the way columns are used, even the concept of domes. It's all inspired by classical Greece.
Let's fast forward now to the Baroque period. It runs roughly from the early 17th century to the mid 18th century. And the term Baroque itself has a pretty interesting backstory, right?
Yeah, it comes from the Portuguese word barroco, which originally referred to a pearl or a gemstone that had an irregular shape. And the interesting thing is that at first it was kind of an insult. It was used to criticize the art of that time because it wasn't as symmetrical and classically perfect as Renaissance art.
So basically they were saying, hey, this is a bit messy.
Yeah, kind of. They were like, this isn't as neat and tidy as what we're used to.
So what would you say are the defining characteristics of Baroque art? Like if you walk into a room and see a Baroque painting or a building, what would jump out at you?
Well, grandeur is key. It's all about being big and impressive. You'll also see dramatic, over-the-top movements, really detailed and theatrical scenes. They use a lot of color, and there's this feeling of intensity and drama.
Okay.
Think about it. Deep colors, lots of contrast, and the use of light is really important, like a spotlight on a dark stage.
I see.
It's a style that feels non-linear, if that makes
Not
sense.
linear.
Like, it's not just a calm, balanced scene. It's more about capturing a moment of passion right before or right after something big happens. It's like a snapshot of heightened emotions.
Okay.
For example, in paintings, they often use dark backgrounds with these sudden bursts of light, which makes the scene feel even more dramatic.
Interesting. So what were some of the historical events that might have influenced this shift toward the Baroque style? It's not like art exists in a bubble, right?
You're right. Art is always a reflection of what's happening in the world. In this case, You have the Renaissance still lingering, but then you also have the Protestant Reformation, which shook up the power of the Catholic Church, and the 30 Years' War, which devastated much of Europe. These were major events that forced people to reevaluate their beliefs and their worldviews. And that upheaval is definitely reflected in the art.
Right.
Think about it. The Renaissance was all about balance, harmony, and perfection. But these events, the wars and the religious conflicts, they challenged that idea of a stable and predictable world. That instability led to this fascination with change, with becoming, with the limitless, which you can see in the art of the Baroque period.
Where in Europe was this style mainly taking hold?
It was pretty widespread. France, Italy, the Netherlands, the German states. But it's important to remember that the Baroque style wasn't exactly the same everywhere. Each region, and even individual artists, brought their own unique flavor to it.
You mentioned painting earlier. Who are some of the big names in Baroque painting that we should know?
Oh, there are some absolute masters. Caravaggio is one, known for his incredibly realistic style and that dramatic use of light and shadow like we talked about.
Yeah.
Then you have Rembrandt and Vermeer in the Netherlands.
Right.
They were amazing at capturing these subtle shifts in light and shadow in everyday scenes. And you can't forget Peter Paul Rubens. His style was so dynamic and full of energy, often depicting these really luxurious and opulent scenes. And early in the period, the Carracci family in Italy really helped set the stage for a lot of the new directions in Baroque art.
And this Baroque aesthetic wasn't just limited to painting, was it?
Not at all. Sculpture and music went through their own Baroque transformations. In sculpture, you see this rejection of strict, straight lines that were so common in classical art. The focus shifted to capturing movement and emotion. Think about those incredibly dynamic and expressive sculptures, often depicting these dramatic scenes from the Bible. Bernini is the big name in Baroque sculpture. And in music, the Baroque period was a time of huge innovation. Composers like Bach and Handel were pushing the boundaries. They were coming up with new ways to play instruments, new approaches to composing, and even new musical forms altogether. Think about cantatas, concertos, sonatas, sinfonias, and of course, opera.
So it seems like Baroque music, like the visual arts, was all about drama and emotion.
Exactly. They used all sorts of techniques to achieve that. Dissonance, for example, which is basically using notes that clash a bit and create this feeling of tension. Chromaticism, which means using notes outside of the usual scale, adding these unexpected colors to the music. Then you have altered harmonies and a kind of counterpoint where the harmony itself leads the melody. All this added to that emotional intensity. They also loved using rhythmic regularity, lots of ornamentation like those really elaborate decorations on the melody. And they even experimented with terrace dynamics, which are like sudden changes in volume and echo effects. All these things added layers of drama and emotional impact to the music.
It's fascinating how they use these techniques to create such powerful effects.
Yeah, and even the instruments changed. The violin family became much more popular and eventually replaced the older viols. It's like the whole soundscape of music was transformed during the Baroque era.
Wow. Okay, so after all that Baroque grandeur and drama, we get the Rococo period in the 18th century. It starts mainly in France and then spreads throughout Europe. How is this style different from the Baroque? What are some of the things that stand out to you?
Well, the Rococo comes about as a kind of reaction to the Baroque, almost like a we need to lighten up type of thing. It's much more playful, lighthearted, even utopian in its themes.
Yeah.
The word Rococo comes from the French rocaille, which refers to the pebbles and shells they often used in their garden, and interior designs. So it's all about decoration and creating these elegant, intimate spaces.
It sounds like it's less about heavy drama and more about being delicate and decorative.
That's it exactly. You see these flowing, asymmetrical forms, lots of elaborate ornamentation. It's not about perfect balance anymore. And the colors are lighter, softer pastels. The stories they tell are more whimsical, romantic, sometimes even a little mischievous.
Interesting.
Rococo really shines in furniture design and interior decoration. Think of those really fancy, ornate rooms in old palaces.
Okay, and then, as so often happens in art history, there's another shift. This time, it's toward neoclassicism. What's the main driving force behind this movement?
With neoclassicism, there's this renewed interest in ancient Roman and Greek art, the simplicity, the core principles, even the specific subjects. Part of this was sparked by the rediscovery of those ancient Roman cities, Pompeii and Herculaneum. It was like a window into the past, and it made people really fascinated with classical art and culture all over again.
So it's like a back-to-basics moment, a return to order and reason after what some might have seen as the over-the-top decoration of the Rococo period.
Exactly. It's a move away from excessive emotion and ornamentation.
I see.
In neoclassical art, you'll see those classical subjects, again, historical scenes, mythology, and they're usually painted with a limited color palette. The lines are clear and precise, and the compositions are very formal, balanced, often symmetrical. It's a very deliberate shift from the Rococo and even the Baroque.
So then, from this emphasis on order and reason, you get Romanticism, which lasted from the late 18th to the mid-19th century. This feels like a big turning point.
It really is. You could say Romanticism is about a shift from the age of reason, that's neoclassicism, to the age of passion.
Right.
There's this longing for a more intense, emotional, and individual experience of life. It's all about breaking free from the rules and structures of neoclassicism. You even see this shift in music in the work of composers like Beethoven. His later compositions are full of this romantic energy.
So what were the Romantics interested in? What kind of art did they create?
They focused on more contemporary subjects, things that were happening around them. So you see more scenes of everyday life, what we call genre scenes. You also see these incredibly dramatic and awe-inspiring landscapes. And they weren't afraid to tackle current events, even political and social issues.
Interesting.
Landscape painting became especially important. It was a way for them to express their awe of nature, particularly as the Industrial Revolution was changing the landscape. It's almost like they were trying to capture the raw power of nature before it was lost to industrialization.
I see.
And this focus on landscape also laid some of the groundwork for what would become abstract art. Artists like J.M.W. Turner were using color and light to create these incredible emotional effects in their landscapes. They were pushing the boundaries of what a landscape could be.
And it sounds like there was a bigger focus on the individual artist's feelings and expressions during this period.
Definitely. It's all about the artist's unique perspective and the way they see the world. You can really see this in the brushwork, the way they apply paint to the canvas. Eugene Delacroix is a great example. His painting, Liberty Leading the People, perfectly captures the Romantic spirit. It depicts a contemporary event with a powerful political message using this dynamic composition and really expressive brushstrokes. It's actually pretty cool. Even though the king bought the painting, he later removed it from public view because he thought the revolutionary ideas were too dangerous.
Wow.
It's a perfect example of how art can be a powerful tool for social and political change.
After the Romantics, we have realism in the mid-19th century. What defines this movement? What's the main shift here?
Well, in many ways, realism is a reaction against the Romantic movement. It's a rejection of those exotic, idealized subjects, the historical dramas, the religious figures, the mythological stories. Instead, they focused on real life, on ordinary people, on the everyday world.
It's a bit more down to earth.
Exactly. And this shift happened alongside some significant social and political changes, like the French Revolution of 1848 and this new idea of the right to work.
Okay.
There was this growing anti-establishment feeling, a desire to focus on the struggles of ordinary people, and that feeling made its way into the art world.
So realism was about showing the world as it really was without romanticizing it.
Absolutely. They wanted to depict real people in their everyday lives, to give a voice to those who are often ignored in art. The style itself is very straightforward, almost like a photograph. They were incredibly detailed and realistic in their depictions.
Okay, then you have Impressionism, which starts in late 19th century France. This movement is really known for its radical changes in artistic technique, right?
Yeah, definitely. Impressionism was all about breaking the rules. One of the biggest changes was painting outdoors en plein air instead of in the studio.
Wow.
This was really controversial at the time. The official salon exhibitions wouldn't even accept their work because it was considered too radical. So the Impressionists had to create their own exhibitions.
That's so cool.
So what makes Impressionism so distinctive is its focus on light and color. They use these short, broken brushstrokes, applying pure, unblended colors side by side so your eye actually does the mixing. They were obsessed with capturing the fleeting effects of light, like those shimmering reflections on water or the way light filters through leaves. They also paid attention to the way light created colored shadows and highlights, which was a pretty revolutionary idea at the time. And while their paintings often look spontaneous and effortless, they actually put a lot of thought into their compositions.
I never knew that.
Yeah, there's a lot more going on beneath the surface than you might think.
Most people probably associate Impressionism with Claude Monet. What was his role in this whole movement?
He was a key figure. In fact, the name Impressionism came from one of his paintings, Impression, Sunrise.
Really?
Yeah. A critic used the word impression to make fun of the painting, and the name stuck. Monet was all about capturing the fleeting moments of light and color. He mostly painted landscapes and was obsessed with working outdoors. He even refused to have a studio.
Wow.
He truly believed in experiencing the world directly and painting what he saw in that moment. He and other Impressionists, like Bertha Morisot, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Camille Pissarro, and Alfred Sisley, basically threw out the old rules of academic painting and championed artistic freedom and individual expression.
It's inspiring to think about them going against the grain like that.
Totally.
Okay, after the Impressionists, we get Art Nouveau in the late 19th and early 20th century. This style is so easy to recognize, isn't it?
Yeah, Art Nouveau is really unique. It was a deliberate attempt to modernize art, to move away from traditional styles.
Okay.
And their inspiration came from nature, but they weren't just copying nature. They were stylizing it in this really elegant, decorative way.
So what should you look for in Art Nouveau?
You'll see lots of those long, flowing lines, like the stems and petals of flowers. They often used rhythmic, curving patterns, sometimes combined with geometric shapes, and they tended to flatten the perspective, making the images feel more two-dimensional.
Okay.
And Art Nouveau wasn't just in painting, it was everywhere. Architecture, furniture design, jewelry, posters. It was this whole movement that aimed to bring beauty and nature into everyday life.
And I think it's cool how they had different names for it in different countries.
Right. In Germany, they called it Jugendstil,
Yeah.
and in Austria, it was secession.
Now let's talk about modernism. This is a huge and complicated period, starting in the late 19th century and going all the way to the mid-20th century. And I think the very idea of what modern means in art changes during this time.
It really does. Before modernism, modern just meant what's happening now. But with modernism, it becomes a whole set of beliefs and ideas. It's about rejecting the old traditions and rules, challenging the authority of the art academies, and exploring completely new ways of seeing and representing the world.
So modernism wasn't just about being new, it was about rebelling against the old.
Exactly. And this rebellion often led to art that was shocking or confusing at the time. It didn't look like anything people were used to, so it was often met with resistance.
Okay.
And Paris was the center of all this.
Yeah.
It was where all these new ideas were being explored and debated. They were pushing back against those powerful salons, which represented everything traditional in the art world.
So within this huge movement of modernism, what are some of the key developments and individual styles that stand out?
It was such an explosive period. You have artists painting outdoors more and more. Influenced by movements like the Barbizon School, they were interested in depicting the world as they saw it, not just from imagination.
Okay.
Then you have this exploration of flatness in painting. They were moving away from trying to create the illusion of depth on a flat canvas.
I see.
And then there's Cubism, pioneered by artists like Picasso. They were literally shattering space and form, breaking objects down into these geometric shapes and showing them from multiple perspectives all at once.
That must have been mind-blowing at the time.
It was. And then you have the rise of abstraction, where you can't even recognize any objects anymore. Artists like Piet Mondrian were exploring pure form and color.
Wow.
And in architecture, movements like the style and the international style emerged. They embraced new industrial materials and focused on functional design.
Okay.
Surrealism dove into the world of dreams and the subconscious, drawing inspiration from the ideas of Sigmund Freud. Artists like Salvador Dali created these bizarre and dreamlike images that challenged viewers to question their perceptions of reality.
Right.
In Germany, you have German Expressionism, which used art to comment on social issues and the anxieties of modern life. Artists like Max Beckmann explored themes of alienation and social injustice.
And of course, in the U.S., you have abstract expressionism with artists like Jackson Pollock and Joan Mitchell. They focused on the act of painting itself, the physical gestures, the energy of the moment.
Right. They weren't trying to represent anything specific. They were more interested in expressing their inner emotions and letting the paint guide them.
One thing that stood out to me in our research was the influence of non-Western art on modernism.
That's a really important point. Modernism was a global phenomenon, and artists were drawing inspiration from all over the world. Japanese woodblock prints, for example, had a huge impact.
Okay.
They used these flat perspectives and bold outlines, which influenced artists like Van Gogh.
Interesting.
And African art, with its powerful forms and symbolic language, inspired artists like Picasso. So it was this exciting mixing of styles happening.
It sounds like modernism was really about breaking down boundaries and opening up to new ways of seeing the world.
It absolutely was. And this is also happening in society as well. You have the rise of the middle class, who became important art collectors. Their interest in everyday subjects and leisure activities also helped to shape the direction of modernism. was a time of huge social and cultural shifts, and art was reflecting all of that.
Okay, so now we're up to postmodernism, which starts around the mid-20th century and is still going on today. It feels like it's another reaction, this time to the ideas and aesthetics of modernism itself.
Yeah, it's like a pendulum swing.
Yeah.
It's probably the most controversial of all the isms. It really gets people talking. Postmodernism starts to challenge the seriousness and elitism of modernism.
I see.
It starts questioning everything. And one of the most noticeable reactions was in architecture. Postmodern architecture was a direct response to those very minimalist, often square, white buildings that modernism loved. Think of Frank Gehry's Weizmann Art Museum. It's completely non-square, almost playful in its design. It uses different materials, and it's not afraid to be a little messy and unconventional.
Okay. So what are some of the key ideas behind postmodernism? What are they reacting to?
Well, at its core, postmodernism is skeptical. It questions big, overarching explanations of history and reality. It's like, can we really know anything for sure? Philosophers like Jean-François Lyotard call these big explanations grand narratives. And postmodernism is all about deconstructing them.
Okay.
The focus shifts to recognizing the diversity of cultures and perspectives. It's like, hey, everyone has their own truth.
Interesting.
And this idea that all truth claims are just language games, that they're social constructs rather than objective realities.
Okay.
Then you have theorists like Frederick Jameson, who looked at postmodernism through a Marxist lens. He argued that it's tied to late capitalist consumer society, where everything becomes a commodity.
Right.
This leads to a blurring of boundaries between high culture and low culture, and it challenges the idea of a stable, coherent self. It's like, who are we in this world of endless consumerism?
It sounds a bit disorienting.
It can be. So how does this translate into postmodern art? What are we looking for? Well, we often see techniques like pastiche, which is this mixing of different styles, sometimes even clashing styles. It's like they're deliberately breaking the rules of good taste. And they blur the lines between high culture and low culture. Think about Andy Warhol's work, like his Brillo boxes. He's taking these everyday objects and elevating them to the status of art.
Right.
And you see a lot of metafiction and meta-art, which means art that is self-referential, aware of its own artificiality. It's not trying to fool you into thinking it's real. It's like, hey, I'm a painting, and I know I'm a painting.
Okay, I get it.
There's also a lot of irony in postmodern art, this playful, detached sense of humor.
It sounds a lot like the world we live in today.
It does, doesn't it? Think about Picasso's Oh, Demoiselle d'Avignon. It's a very modernist work focused on the individual artist's vision. Then compare that to Warhol's Marilyn Diptych. It's using these mass-produced images, questioning originality, and exploring the ways celebrity and sexuality are constructed.
Okay.
Even poetry gets in on the act. Frank O'Hara's poem The Day Lady Died is a great example. He mixes high culture and low culture, throws in some self-awareness, and it's all tied to this event, the death of a celebrity, which was broadcast through mass media.
It sounds like postmodernism is reflecting the fragmentation and the constant flow of information that we experience in the modern world.
You got it.
So how does this all relate to the rise of multiculturalism, which is also happening in the latter half of the 20th century?
Well, they're both embracing pluralism,
Yeah.
this idea that there are multiple valid perspectives. Postmodernism, with its critique of grand narratives, helps us understand and appreciate different cultures. And multiculturalism is a response to oppression, a call for recognizing and validating marginalized voices.
Okay.
They both challenge the idea of a single dominant culture. Take the poem A Different Image by Dudley Randall. He's challenging stereotypical images of a specific culture without claiming to have the one true perspective on that culture. It's a perfect example of how postmodernism and multiculturalism can work together.
Then there's contemporary art, which is happening right now. Is it simply the art of today?
In a sense, yes. It's the art that's being made in the present moment. But it's also a reaction to the fact that modern had become mainstream. It's almost like we needed a new term to describe what was happening after modernism had run its course.
So how is contemporary art different?
Well, it's less tied to a specific set of ideologies like modernism was. It's more about reflecting current experiences and ideas.
Yeah.
And there's some key moments that mark this shift.
Okay, like what?
Like when Robert Rauschenberg literally erased a drawing by Willem de Kooning, or Yves Klein's body art events, or think about Andy Warhol again, taking those everyday objects and turning them into art.
Right, right.
There's a rejection of the pure abstraction modernism and a return to figuration, to telling stories again. And you see this questioning of progress, this skepticism towards grand narratives that we talked about earlier.
It sounds a lot like postmodernism, actually.
It is. And I think that's a key point. Contemporary art is still grappling with a lot of the same questions and anxieties that postmodernism raised.
Our research also mentioned street art and the so-called Banksy effect.
Right. Street art has become this incredibly powerful form of political commentary.
Yeah.
And Banksy, in particular, has had a huge impact.
Right.
He's blurred the lines between graffiti and fine art, making art that's accessible to everyone, not just the people who go to galleries.
Exactly.
And his success has opened doors for other street artists like Keith Haring, Jean-Michel Basquiat, Shepard Fairey, just to name a few. It's like street art has entered the mainstream art world.
It's amazing how art can be used to challenge the status quo and make people think.
Absolutely.
Speaking of accessibility, I think it's also worth mentioning how museums are adapting to make art more available to everyone, especially with virtual tours and online exhibitions.
Yeah, that's a really positive development.
Like, remember during the pandemic when places like the Prado started offering virtual tours? People from all over the world could suddenly experience these masterpieces, like Picasso's Guernica.
Right. And it's a good reminder of how art can shape our understanding of major events. Guernica was painted in response to a horrific bombing during the Spanish Civil War.
Wow.
Picasso used it to raise awareness and funds for the victims. It's gone from being a political statement to an enduring symbol of peace and the horrors of war.
It's amazing how art can have that kind of power.
It really is.
Okay, lastly, I wanted to touch on Vincent van Gogh, who is often seen as a bridge between Impressionism and Modernism. How does his work fit into this whole story of art history?
Van Gogh is a fascinating figure. He took elements from Impressionism, like those loose brushstrokes and his interest in light and color. But he pushed them even further, creating this intensely personal and emotional style that paved the way for modernism. It's incredible to think that he produced so much work, even while struggling with mental illness. And his love of Japanese woodblock prints is evident in his paintings.
I can see that.
Compare his Starry Night to Hokusai's Great Wave. There are definitely similarities in the composition and the way they stylize the natural world.
It's cool how he brought all these influences together.
And because he was often confined, he had to rely on his imagination, which led to these really powerful and expressive works. The Starry Night is a perfect example. That swirling sky, the intense colors, it's all about expressing his inner world.
It's interesting that you mentioned the Starry Night because I read somewhere that he actually considered it a failure.
Yeah. He had really high standards for himself and often struggled with self-doubt.
I guess even the greats have their doubts.
I think so, yeah.
Well, this has been a really incredible journey through art history. It's fascinating to see how all these movements connect and build on each other.
It shows how art is always in conversation with itself and with the world around it. It's constantly evolving and reacting to new ideas and events.
Exactly. And even the most radical, out there, contemporary art has its roots in these historical movements.
It's all part of the same ongoing story.
So as you think about all the art we've talked about, think about which movement resonates with you the most.
Yeah, which one speaks to your experience of the world today?
And maybe even explore those artists and movements a bit further on your own.
There's so much to discover.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into art history. It's been a real pleasure exploring it with you.